The wind atop the building was cold, a biting contrast to the sweltering afternoon heat of Muzurifu. It whipped at Izuku Midoriya's oversized school uniform, snapping the dark fabric against his thin frame like a flag of surrender. Below him, the city sprawled in a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of glass, steel, and concrete. It was a world built by and for the extraordinary. A world of quirks. A world he had just been emphatically, irreversibly locked out of. Izuku stood frozen on the rooftop, the heavy metal door clicking shut behind the retreating figure of his idol. I cannot simply say you can become a hero even without power. The words hung in the air, heavier than the smog that clung to the city's skyline. They didn't echo, they didn't fade. They simply embedded themselves into the marrow of his bones, dragging him down until his knees buckled. Izuku dropped to the rough, tar-papered surface of the roof. It wasn't a villain who had defeated him. It wasn't a tragic accident. It was Toshinori Yagi. It was All Might, the symbol of peace, the man whose blazing, fearless smile had been the bedrock of Izuku's fragile sanity for the past 10 years. Izuku's hands, trembling uncontrollably, clawed at the fabric of his trousers. His vision blurred as a hot, miserable pressure built behind his eyes, finally spilling over his freckled cheeks in heavy, silent drops. They hit the rooftop with soft, dark splatters. You have to be realistic, kid. Realistic. That was the word the doctor had used when Izuku was 4, pointing to a glowing X-ray of a foot with a redundant joint. That was the word his mother had implied when she clung to him, weeping in the dark glow of a computer screen, apologizing for his genetics. That was the word Katsuki Bakugo had beaten into him, day after day, explosion after explosion, leaving starburst burns on his shoulders and the scent of caramelized sugar and ozone in his hair. He was quirkless. He was a relic of human evolution, a genetic dead end, a statistical anomaly of the past 20%. In a world where men could summon fire, women could alter gravity, and children could bend steel with their minds, Izuku Midoriya was just flesh and bone. And yet, he had clung to the dream. He had filled 13 thick notebooks with obsessive, meticulous analysis. He had studied the tensile strength of Kamui wood's branches, the aerodynamic drag of hawk's feathers, the caloric conversion rate of fat gum's lipid shields. He understood quirks better than most of the people who wielded them. He knew the blueprints of a hero, but blueprints were useless if you didn't have the materials to build them. Izuku slowly pushed himself up from the ground. His limbs felt like they were made of lead. His chest was a hollow, echoing cavern. He looked over the edge of the building, down at the bustling streets. The people below looked like ants. They were going about their lives, secure in the knowledge that they were protected by the very man who had just shattered Izuku's universe. He touched the edge of the railing. The metal was warm from the sun, solid, uncompromising. Take a swan dive off the roof of the building. Kaken's voice hissed in his memory, a venomous whisper from only a few hours ago. Hope for a quirk in your next life. Izuku's grip tightened on the railing until his knuckles turned white. He closed his eyes, leaning forward slightly. The wind rushed past his ears, sounding almost like the roar of a crowd. It would be so easy, just a shift in center of gravity. Just one step forward into the empty air, and the pain, the humiliation, the relentless, agonizing hope would all finally stop. But a deeper, older instinct flared in his chest. A stubborn, pathetic flicker of defiance. No. He pulled back, gasping as if he had just breached the surface of freezing water. He stumbled away from the ledge, his heart hammering against his ribs in a terrified, frantic rhythm. He wasn't going to do that. He couldn't do that to his mother. He couldn't let Kaken be right. He was pathetic, yes. But he wasn't a coward. Izuku turned his back on the skyline and walked toward the stairwell door. Every step felt like wading through wet cement. He pulled open the heavy metal door and began the long descent into the shadows of the building, leaving his childhood on the roof. The streets of Muzurifu were an assault on the senses. Neon signs flickered with vibrant advertisements, street food vendors called out over the hiss of frying oil, and the constant, low hum of traffic vibrated through the soles of Izuku's red sneakers. He walked like a ghost haunting his own life. People brushed past him, oblivious to the boy whose world had just ended. A man with skin made of cracked gray stone laughed on his cell phone. A young woman with a bouquet of bioluminescent hair hailed a taxi. A group of middle schoolers ran past, one of them casually levitating a soccer ball between his hands. Magic. Everyday magic. And Izuku was trapped on the outside, looking in through a pane of unbreakable glass. He reached into his yellow backpack, his fingers brushing against the rough, burnt edge of his notebook. Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13. The smell of charred paper and scorched fish from the koi pond lingered on the pages. He pulled it out, staring at the cover. What was the point? Why had he spent thousands of hours studying the exact chemical composition of Mount Lady's costume elasticity? Why did he memorize the structural weak points of carbon fiber support gear? He had poured his entire soul into understanding a world that had categorically rejected his application. He stopped near a public trash can. It was one of those automated, heavy-duty ones, made of thick, reinforced aluminum to withstand minor Quirk accidents. Izuku hovered his hand over the opening, the burnt notebook dangling from his fingers. Drop it. Let it go. Go home, apologize to Mom, and start looking up vocational schools for accounting or data entry. That was realistic. His fingers loosened. The notebook slipped down half an inch. Boom! The ground shook. Izuku violently flinched, pulling the notebook back to his chest as a concussive shockwave rolled down the street. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass and the panicked screams of a crowd. Instinct, honed by years of chasing sirens and following villain fights, overrode his depression. Before he even registered what he was doing, Izuku was running. His feet pounded against the pavement, carrying him toward Tatooine's shopping district, following the rising column of thick, black smoke that was blotting out the late afternoon sun. No, stop! His rational mind screamed. You're not a fanboy anymore. It's over. But his body wouldn't listen. He had to see. He had to analyze. It was the only way his brain knew how to process the world. He rounded the corner, pushing through a throng of fleeing civilians, and came to a dead halt. The entrance to the shopping alley was a war zone. Entire storefronts had been blown outward, scattering twisted metal, burning merchandise, and pulverized concrete across the asphalt. Plumes of roaring orange fire licked at the buildings, feeding on ruptured gas lines and shattered wooden beams. Izuku pushed his way to the front of the spectator crowd, pressing against the yellow police barricade tape. He scanned the scene, his analytical mind snapping into its familiar, high-speed rhythm. Fire. Widespread structural damage. Civilian casualties likely, though the perimeter seemed secure. Where are the heroes? He spotted them instantly. Death Arms, the physical powerhouse, was standing near the edge of the flames, shielding his face with thick, muscular forearms. Kamui Woods was perched on a nearby lamppost, looking agitated. Empty Lady was standing 2 streets over, completely useless in her gigantic form as the narrow street prevented her entry. Backdraft was spraying water from his hose-like hands, but it was barely containing the inferno. Why aren't they attacking? Izuku thought, his eyes darting across the wreckage. Death Arms has the strength to clear the debris, but his quirk offers no heat resistance. If he goes into the fire, he'll suffer third-degree burns. Kamui Woods is made of timber. He's utterly neutralized by the flames. Empty Lady needs a 2-lane avenue just to walk. They're stuck. It was a textbook tactical deadlock. A highly specific environmental hazard that perfectly countered the available hero roster. They were waiting for someone with a suitable quirk. They were waiting for a hydrokinetic, or an ice user, or All Might. Wait, All Might. Izuku's stomach plummeted into a bottomless abyss of ice. Through a gap in the roaring flames he saw the villain. It was a massive, undulating mass of dark, putrid sludge. Eyes like oversized dinner plates rolled wildly within the liquid body, a jagged, slavering maw ripping open to roar at the heroes. It was the sludge villain. The exact same villain that had nearly suffocated Izuku under the overpass just hours ago. The villain that All Might had captured in 2 plastic soda bottles. How did it get out? Izuku's mind raced, tracing back the events. All Might had saved him. Izuku had desperately grabbed All Might's leg as he jumped away. They had landed on the roof. The bottles. When Izuku had latched onto All Might's leg, the hero had been caught off guard in midair. The bottles must have slipped from his pockets. They must have fallen into the city during the jump, Izuku brought a trembling hand to his mouth. This is my fault. The fire, the destruction, it's because of me. I got in his way. His vision swam with fresh tears of pure, agonizing guilt. He had not only failed to become a hero, he had actively become a burden, causing a disaster that was tearing up a city block. He looked away, unable to bear the sight of the monster, when something caught his eye. Within the churning, muddy vortex of the villain's body, something was thrashing. Izuku squinted through the heat haze and the smoke. It was a person. The villain had a hostage. The sludge was forcing its way down the victim's throat, possessing their body, using them as a human meat shield against the heroes. Then, a series of rapid, deafening explosions detonated from within the sludge. Bam! 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 Bright, blinding flashes of caramel-colored light illuminated the alley. The explosions blasted the surrounding brickwork, feeding the fires, but they did nothing to the liquid villain, simply passing through the sludge or being absorbed by its mass. Izuku's heart stopped. He knew those explosions. He had felt them against his own skin. He had smelled that exact scent of burning nitroglycerin for a decade. The sludge shifted, and for one agonizing, crystal-clear second, the hostage's face was pushed to the surface. Ash-blonde hair, spiked with sweat and desperation. Crimson eyes, wide, bloodshot, and frantic. It was Katsuki. Kaken was drowning. Izuku felt the world fall away. The roaring of the flames, the shouting of the police, the murmurs of the crowd, it all faded into a muffled, distant static. Everything tunneled down to those red eyes. Katsuki Bakugo, the boy with the strongest quirk, the boy destined for greatness, the boy who told Izuku to kill himself, was looking at the crowd with an expression Izuku had never, ever seen on his face. It was an expression of total, helpless terror. He was looking for someone to save him. Izuku didn't think. There was no conscious decision. There was no weighing of options, no calculation of risk, no memory of All Might's crushing words. His legs moved. He dropped his burned notebook. He ducked under the yellow police tape. Hey! Kid, get back here! Death Arms bellowed, his voice cracking like thunder. Are you insane? Izuku didn't hear him. He was already sprinting, his red sneakers pounding against the cracked pavement. The heat hit him like a physical wall, singeing his eyelashes and sucking the oxygen from his lungs, but he didn't slow down. What am I doing? His brain finally screamed as he crossed the threshold of the fire. I don't have a quirk. I don't have a weapon. What can I possibly do? The sludge villain noticed him. The massive eyes swiveled, locking onto the small, quirkless boy charging through the inferno. You again! The villain gargled, its voice a horrific, bubbling bass that vibrated in Izuku's chest. You want to die that badly? Izuku was 10 meters away. 5 meters. Think. Think. His analytical mind, desperate and terrified, ripped through thousands of pages of notes. Sludge composition, highly viscous, non-Newtonian fluid. Physical strikes are ineffective. Weak points, eyes, teeth. Requires a solid, high-velocity projectile to disrupt the ocular fluid. Izuku reached back, unzipping his yellow backpack mid-stride. He spun, using his momentum to hurl the heavy bag like a discus. It sailed through the air, unzipping further, scattering textbooks, pencil cases, and a heavy metal compass. The corner of a thick math textbook clipped the villain right in its massive left eye. Gah! The villain shrieked, the sludge recoiling instinctively. The grip on Katsuki loosened just a fraction of an inch, allowing the blond boy to gasp a ragged, desperate breath of smoky air. Kaken! Izuku screamed, lunging forward, his hands sinking into the disgusting, foul-smelling mud. He clawed at the sludge, trying to dig his childhood friend out, his fingernails scraping uselessly against the liquid mass. Deku! Katsuki choked out, his crimson eyes wide with disbelief. Why are you here? I don't know. Izuku cried, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the soot. My legs just moved. You looked like you needed saving. Katsuki's eyes widened, a complex storm of pride, shame, and shock flashing through them. But the moment was over. The villain recovered, its eye blinking rapidly as the pain subsided into furious rage. You little brat! The villain roared. A massive tendril of thick, heavy sludge reared back like a cobra preparing to strike. "I'll crush you!" Time slowed to an absolute crawl. Izuku looked up at the descending mass of sludge. It was moving with enough kinetic force to snap his spine like a dry twig. "I'm going to die." The realization was terrifyingly clear. He was going to die here, in the dirt, having achieved nothing. Katsuki was going to die right after him. The heroes were too far away. All Might wasn't coming. He was completely, utterly powerless. A primal, foundational scream echoed in the deepest recesses of Izuku Midoriya's soul. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of cosmic, violent frustration. "I need a weapon!" His soul roared against the unfairness of the universe. "I need something. Anything. I know how they work. I know the tensile strength of steel. I know the carbon density of iron. I know how to fight. I just need the tools. Give me a tool." As the sludge tendril descended, Izuku threw his hands up in a desperate, pathetic gesture of defense. His bare, scarred hands slammed into the shattered, pulverized concrete and twisted rebar of the ruined street beneath him. In that exact microsecond, as his body flooded with lethal levels of adrenaline, cortisol, and absolute psychological trauma, a genetic lock buried deep within his DNA, a lock that had remained rusted shut for 14 years, finally snapped. Pain, agonizing, blinding, white-hot pain ripped through Izuku's body. It didn't come from the villain. It came from inside him. It felt as though every lipid, every calorie, every ounce of stored energy in his cells had been doused in gasoline and set completely on fire. His stomach violently cramped, a sensation of sudden, extreme starvation hitting him so hard his vision flashed neon green. "What is this?" His hands, pressed flat against the shattered concrete, began to glow. Not a subtle glow. A blinding, searing, radioactive emerald green light exploded from his palms, illuminating the entire alleyway in a ghastly, beautiful hue. The concrete beneath his fingers didn't just break, it dissolved. Izuku's hyperactive, analytical mind, pushed to the absolute brink of panic, was suddenly dragged into a terrifyingly clear, multidimensional space. He wasn't just touching the concrete. He could feel its molecular structure. He felt the calcium carbonate, the silica, the coarse aggregates. He felt the iron atoms and the rusted rebar beneath it. His quirk was demanding a blueprint. It was a hungry, violent forge that had just been turned on, and it needed a mold. "Weapon!" Izuku's brain screamed. Blunt force trauma. High density. Iron. Carbon. Pipe. He had drawn 1,000 weapons in his notebooks. He knew the exact dimensions of Eraserhead's binding cloth housing. He knew the exact weight distribution of Native's tomahawks. He knew the microscopic lattice structure of high-carbon steel from studying support gear metallurgy. His mind violently shoved that blueprint into the glowing energy of his hands. The world rushed back. To Katsuki, to the heroes, to the paralyzed crowd, it looked like a miracle. The emerald light flared like a miniature sun. The loose rubble, dirt, and twisted rebar around Izuku's hands violently sucked inward, swirling in a miniature tornado of green energy. The ambient matter restructured, snapping together with a sound like grinding tectonic plates. In less than a second, the light vanished. Izuku Midoriya was no longer empty-handed. His blistered, smoking hands were gripping a perfectly cylindrical, hyperdense, 4-foot-long pipe of pure, unadulterated carbon steel. It was warm to the touch, perfectly balanced, and thrumming with residual energy. Izuku didn't question it. The primal survival instinct was still completely in control. With a roar that tore his vocal cords, Izuku pivoted on his heel, using the momentum of his sudden, terrifyingly heavy weapon. He swung the steel pipe like a baseball bat, putting every ounce of his adrenaline-fueled strength into the arc. The tendril of sludge was coming down, but Izuku's swing intercepted it perfectly. Crack! The sound of the steel pipe connecting with the villain's secondary eye was sickeningly loud. It was the sound of a water balloon filled with concrete being hit by a freight train. The villain didn't just recoil. The immense kinetic force of the dense steel weapon ruptured the sludge's hydrostatic pressure. The eye completely burst in a spray of viscous fluid. Aawewawak! The villain unleashed a sound that rattled the windows of the remaining buildings. The immense pain and the shockwave of the blow destabilized the monster's form. The grip on Katsuki completely shattered. The blond boy fell forward onto the asphalt, coughing up black sludge, gasping violently for air. Izuku stood over him, panting heavily, his eyes wide and glowing with a faint, residual green hue. He gripped the steel pipe, raising it defensive, ready to swing again. He looked like a cornered animal, a feral, terrifying defender. The villain, half-blinded and losing its structural integrity, lashed out blindly, creating a massive tidal wave of sludge to drown them both. Izuku braced his feet. He was ready to fight to the death, but a shadow fell over them. The wind shifted. A massive, overwhelming pressure descended upon the alleyway, blowing away the flames and scattering the smoke. "I am pathetic," a deep, resonant voice boomed, carrying a weight that made the very air tremble. Izuku gasped, looking up. Taishinori Yagi, in his fully muscled, gigantic form of All Might, stood between them and the tidal wave of sludge. Blood leaked from the hero's mouth, his muscles trembling with strain, but his blue eyes blazed with an uncompromising, terrifying fury. "I told you the traits that make a great champion," All Might roared, grabbing the arm of his suit, pulling his fist back. The air around his arm began to visibly distort from sheer pressure. "But I didn't live up to my own ideals." All Might looked over his massive shoulder, locking eyes with Izuku. In that look, there was an apology, an astonishment, and a profound, undeniable respect. "Pros are always risking their lives." All Might swung. Detroit. Smash! The punch didn't just hit the villain. It hit the atmosphere. A localized hurricane erupted from All Might's fist. The sheer, unfathomable wind pressure hit the sludge villain, completely atomizing its liquid body into a million droplets, scattering it across the alleyway and into the sky. The flames in the surrounding buildings were instantly snuffed out by the vacuum effect. The wind tore through the street, forcing Izuku to drop to his knees, driving his newly forged steel pipe into the asphalt to keep from being blown away. Katsuki dug his fingers into the ground, screaming as the gale ripped past them. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Silence descended upon Tatooine's shopping district. Izuku looked up. The sky above them, previously clear and blue, had darkened. Thick, heavy rain clouds had gathered, forced together by the updraft of All Might's punch. A single drop of water hit Izuku's cheek. Then another. Within seconds, a torrential downpour washed over the ruined street, cooling the scorched earth, and washing the soot from Izuku's face. He changed the weather, Izuku thought, his mind blank, numb with shock. With a single punch. "Hey! Kid!" The spell was broken. Death Arms, Kamui Woods, and Backdraft were rushing into the alleyway. The police followed close behind, quickly moving to scoop up the scattered, unconscious remains of the sludge villain into hazard containment bags. Izuku remained on his knees in the rain. He felt completely hollowed out. His stomach was twisting in a sickening, agonizing cramp, and a massive headache was pounding behind his eyes. "What the hell were you thinking?" Death Arms yelled, grabbing Izuku by the shoulder and hauling him roughly to his feet. "You could have been killed. There was absolutely no reason for a civilian to charge into a hostage situation." "He's right," Kamui Woods reprimanded, his wooden face stern. "We had the situation under control. Your reckless actions only endangered yourself and the hostage. You have a powerful quirk, kid, but you can't just use it without a license." A quirk. The word echoed in Izuku's ringing ears. He didn't hear the rest of their scolding. He didn't hear them praising Katsuki for his bravery and powerful explosions. He just stood there, the rain soaking his uniform, letting the heroes yell at him. He slowly raised his hands. He was still holding the pipe. It was heavy. It was real. He dragged the tip of it across the wet asphalt, listening to the harsh, metallic scraping sound. He dropped it. It hit the ground with a heavy, resonant clang. Izuku looked at his palms. The skin was violently blistered, raw and red, with faint, glowing green veins pulsing just beneath the epidermis. His hands were trembling, but not from fear. "I made that," he thought, his analytical mind struggling to grasp the impossibility of the last 5 minutes. "I took the concrete. I took the rebar. I broke it down. I reorganized the molecular lattice. I formed carbon steel." He touched his stomach. The hunger was agonizing. It felt like he hadn't eaten in 3 weeks. His body felt lighter, weaker, as if a layer of fat and muscle had been completely stripped away. Matter cannot be created or destroyed, his mind rationalized, racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Only altered. To rearrange matter on an atomic scale requires an astronomical amount of energy. The quirk. It didn't come from nowhere. It used me. It burned my calories. It burned my lipids. It fueled the forge. Hey! Deku. Izuku blinked, snapping out of his trance. Katsuki Bakugo was standing a few feet away. He was soaked to the bone, covered in soot, and shivering slightly. But his crimson eyes were locked onto Izuku with a terrifying, complex intensity. It wasn't the usual arrogant glare. It was confusion. It was anger. It was an existential crisis. Kaken, Izuku croaked, his voice raspy from the smoke. I didn't ask for your help, Katsuki snarled, though his voice lacked its usual explosive bite. His fists were clenched at his sides, trembling. I didn't need you to save me, and I don't know what kind of sick trick you pulled today, pulling a weapon out of thin air. Katsuki took a step forward, his teeth bared in a snarl. But you're still a quirkless nobody. Don't you ever look down on me again. With that, Katsuki turned and stalked away into the rain, pushing past the paramedics who were trying to wrap a blanket around his shoulders. Izuku watched him go. For the first time in 10 years, Katsuki's words didn't hurt. They just sounded hollow. Izuku looked back down at the steel pipe lying in the rain. He wasn't quirkless. 14 years of dormancy. A genetic trait so deeply buried that it required the absolute, terrifying threshold of near-death psychological trauma to unlock. A quirk that required a massive caloric toll and the exact, architectural knowledge of a given object to function. A quirk perfectly suited for a boy who had spent his entire life obsessively documenting and analyzing the blueprints of heroes. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell over him. Izuku looked up to see All Might, now back in his deflated, skeletal form, standing under an umbrella provided by a police officer. The hero was looking at him, a profound, heavy silence passing between them. All Might nodded once. Slowly. Respectfully. Then, the hero turned and walked away to speak with the police. Izuku stood alone in the rain, the blistering pain in his hands burning like a brand. His stomach growled so violently he nearly threw up, but a strange, terrifying smile slowly stretched across his soot-stained face. He had a quirk. He had a quirk that could build anything he understood. He had a brain filled with the most advanced hero support gear on the planet. He pulled out his phone from his wet pocket. The screen was cracked, but it still lit up. He checked the time. It was 8 a.m. on a Friday. The UA High School entrance exam, the practical test of combat and robotics, began at exactly 8 a.m. on Saturday. He had exactly 24 hours. 24 hours to understand his quirk. 24 hours to learn how to fight. 24 hours to stock up on enough calories to prevent his own body from eating itself alive. The forge had been ignited. Now, he had to build a hero. Time remaining, 22 hours. The train ride back to his neighborhood was a blur of muted colors and muffled sounds. Izuku Midoriya sat on the hard plastic seat of the commuter rail, his wet, soot-stained uniform clinging uncomfortably to his shivering frame. The other passengers gave him a wide berth, shooting him sideways glances that ranged from mild concern to overt disgust. He smelled of smoke, ozone, and burnt sugar. His yellow backpack, partially melted at the strap, sat heavily on his lap. He didn't notice the stairs. He didn't hear the rhythmic, hypnotic clack-clack of the train on the rails. His entire universe had narrowed down to the palms of his hands. He kept them resting on his thighs, palms facing upward. The skin was violently red, blistered and jagged, ugly patches that mirrored the chaotic dispersal of immense heat. But beneath the raw, peeling epidermis, something was happening. A faint, almost imperceptible emerald light pulsed in time with his racing heartbeat. The veins on his wrists, usually a pale blue, traced a network of luminescent green beneath his skin. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a hallucination brought on by near-death trauma. He had a quirk. For 14 years, Izuku had lived in a world of absolute, unyielding binary. You either had power, or you were powerless. He had been clinically diagnosed as the latter. He had seen the X-rays of his feet. He had the redundant toe joint, the evolutionary anchor that supposedly tied him to baseline humanity. The doctors had been certain. His mother had been heartbroken. Katsuki Bakugo had been vindicated. Yet less than an hour ago, he had knelt in the rubble of Tatooine's shopping district and turned a pile of pulverized concrete and rusted rebar into a perfectly balanced, hyperdense cylinder of weaponized carbon steel. How? Izuku's hyperanalytical mind, a machine that had spent a decade dissecting the quirks of others, finally turned its terrifying, obsessive focus inward. The doctor was wrong, Izuku thought, his fingers twitching as a jolt of phantom electricity shot up his forearm. Or rather, the science was incomplete. The toe joint isn't an absolute indicator, it's a statistical correlation. My quirk didn't manifest at age 4 because it couldn't. It lacked the necessary triggers. What were the triggers? He closed his eyes, forcing his mind back to the alleyway. The heat of the fire. The smell of sludge. Katsuki's desperate, drowning eyes. The descending tendril of lethal force. Absolute, catastrophic psychological and physical trauma, Izuku concluded, swallowing hard against a dry throat. A fight-or-flight response pushed so far past the red line that it shattered a genetic safety lock. But why this specific quirk? His mother Inko could pull small objects toward her, a low-level form of telekinesis. His father, Hisashi, could breathe fire. Fire and telekinesis, Izuku mentally calculated, the gears in his head spinning with dizzying speed. If you combine the ability to manipulate matter at a distance with the generation of extreme, localized heat, you don't get fire-breathing telekinesis. If the heat is applied on a microscopic, atomic level, and the telekinesis is used to manipulate molecular bonds, you get restructuring. You get a forge. He opened his eyes, staring at his glowing veins. He hadn't just shaped the steel pipe. He had made it. He had taken the iron oxide from the rusted rebar, stripped away the oxygen using the ambient carbon in the concrete, compressed the molecular lattice, and forged a high-carbon steel alloy in a fraction of a second. The implications were staggering. It was an emission/transformation hybrid quirk of unprecedented complexity. The train hissed to a halt at his station. The doors slid open. Izuku stood up, his legs trembling slightly, and stepped out onto the platform. The mid-morning air was humid, the rain from All Might's punch having evaporated into a stifling mugginess. It was 10:14 a.m. The UA High School entrance exam began tomorrow at 8 a.m. He had less than 22 hours to take a power he had just discovered and turn it into something capable of passing the most grueling physical examination in the country. He needed to understand its limits, its rules, and its cost. He broke into a run. The Midori apartment was quiet when Izuku finally slipped the key into the lock. He turned it slowly, wincing at the metallic click, and eased the door open. He took off his ruined red sneakers, lining them up neatly in the Genkin. From the living room, he could hear the low murmur of the television. A daytime talk show discussing the sludge villain incident. His mother was likely in the kitchen or glued to the screen. Izuku crept down the hallway, keeping his back to the wall, holding his breath. If his mother saw him like this, covered in soot, uniform burned, hands blistered, she would immediately call an ambulance. She would panic. She would lock him in his room and forbid him from taking the exam tomorrow. He couldn't deal with her tears right now. Not when he was on the precipice of a miracle. He reached his bedroom door, turned the knob, and slipped inside, pressing his back against the wood as it clicked shut. He let out a long, shaky exhale. His room was exactly as he had left it that morning, yet it felt entirely alien. Posters of All Might covered every conceivable inch of wall space. Action figures stood in victorious poses on his desk. The room was a shrine to a man who, just hours ago, had crushed his dreams on a rooftop, only to silently validate them in an alleyway. Izuku walked over to his desk, shedding his ruined uniform jacket. He turned on his small desk lamp, the warm yellow light washing over his cluttered workspace. He needed to test the quirk. He needed a controlled environment. Okay, Izuku whispered to himself, his voice sounding raspy and unfamiliar in the quiet room. Hypothesis: I can restructure inorganic matter into new forms. Parameters unknown. Let's start small. He rummaged through his desk drawers, pulling out a handful of standard number 2 wooden pencils, a few plastic erasers, a broken metal compass, and a handful of copper coins. He arranged them in a neat pile in the center of his desk mat. Wood, graphite, synthetic rubber, steel, copper, he muttered, taking inventory of the raw materials. If I can manipulate molecular bonds, I should be able to recombine these elements into something more complex. He looked at his smartphone sitting on the edge of the desk. It was a standard mass-market model. Glass screen, plastic casing, lithium-ion battery, silicon microchips. Goal: replicate the smartphone. Izuku took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He reached out, hovering his blistered hands over the pile of stationery and coins. He tried to recall the exact feeling he had in the alleyway. The desperate, violent need for a tool. The sensation of his mind diving into the microscopic world. Turn on, he commanded himself. Do it again. He pressed his hands flat against the pile of materials. Nothing happened. Izuku frowned. He pressed harder, gritting his teeth. Come on. Work. You worked for a pipe, work for this. Still nothing. The pencils remained pencils. The coins remained coins. Izuku pulled his hands back in frustration. Why wasn't it working? Was it a one-time fluke? Was it tied to his adrenaline levels? Did he need to be in mortal danger to use it? If that was the case, the quirk was practically useless for a controlled exam environment. Think, Izuku. What was different in the alley? He closed his eyes, mentally rewinding the tape of his memory. I was desperate, yes. But my mind wasn't blank. When I touched the concrete, I didn't just want a weapon. My brain actively mapped it out. I thought about the carbon density. I visualized the cylinder. I pictured the atomic lattice of steel. I forced a blueprint onto the energy. He opened his eyes, looking down at the pile of pencils and his smartphone. I don't just need the materials, Izuku whispered, a chilling realization washing over him. I need the blueprint. A perfect, flawless blueprint. He placed his hands back over the pile. This time, he didn't just push his energy into the items. He closed his eyes and forced his mind to visualize the smartphone. He pictured the plastic casing. He imagined the copper coins stretching into thin, delicate wires. He pictured the graphite from the pencils flattening out to form a battery core. He pushed the image out of his brain and down through his arms, into his palms. Instantly, his hands flared with that same, searing emerald light. Gah! Izuku gasped as a sharp, sudden heat radiated from his palms. Beneath his hands, the matter began to destabilize. The wooden pencils liquefied, dissolving into a swirling slurry of carbon and organic compounds. The copper coins melted into bright, glowing droplets that hovered in the air. The plastic erasers vaporized into a pungent gas that immediately began to condense. Izuku's mind was suddenly dragged violently into the microscopic space. It was like suddenly being plugged into a supercomputer. He could feel the atomic structures of the materials. He could feel the carbon atoms, the copper atoms, the zinc. Form the phone, he commanded the swirling mass of energy. Build the casing. Thread the wires. The green light intensified, blinding him. The materials began to knit together. A dark, rectangular shape began to form on the desk. But then, the process stuttered. Wait, the quirk seemed to scream back at him in a language of raw data. How does the microchip work? Where does the silicon go? What is the atomic sequence of the motherboard? Izuku panicked. He didn't know. He knew what a phone looked like. He knew it had a motherboard, a processor, and a battery. But he didn't know the microscopic architecture of a microchip. He didn't know the exact chemical ratio of the screen's tempered glass. He was trying to build a skyscraper without knowing how to make cement. His mental image of the phone shattered. The green light shifted violently to a harsh, angry red. Pop! A miniature explosion rocked the desk. Izuku yelped, throwing himself backward as a cloud of thick, black smoke plumed up toward the ceiling. He hit the floor hard, coughing violently, waving his hands to clear the air. When the smoke finally dissipated, Izuku crawled back to the desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. The pencils, the coins, and the erasers were gone. In their place was a useless, fused lump of slag. It looked like a piece of burnt toast made of twisted copper wire, brittle graphite, and melted, bubbling plastic. It was completely inert. When he poked it with his finger, it crumbled into a pile of gray ash. Izuku stared at the ash, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He understood now. This wasn't a magic wand. He couldn't just create whatever he wanted purely on a whim, or a vague idea. The quirk, he decided to tentatively name it Matterforge, operated on the absolute, uncompromising laws of chemistry and physics. It was a 3D printer, and his brain was the computer. If the CAD file was incomplete, the print would fail. If he didn't understand the exact chemical makeup, the structural integrity, and the internal mechanics of what he was trying to create, the matter would reject the forging process and collapse into slag. I need exact blueprints, Izuku whispered, wiping a smear of soot from his cheek. I need to know every single measurement, every material property, every joint and screw. A crushing weight settled over his shoulders. How could he possibly memorize the atomic structure of complex weapons and gear in 22 hours? It was impossible. He was a middle school student, not a materials science engineer. The exam was tomorrow. The pipe had worked because a solid cylinder of steel was the simplest structural shape in existence. But a pipe wouldn't be enough to take down the massive robotic villains Yui was famous for using in their practical exams. He needed traps. He needed specialized gear. He needed mobility tools. He buried his face in his hands. It was over before it even began. He had the ultimate power, and he was too ignorant to wield it. Then, his eyes caught a glimpse of yellow through his fingers. His burnt backpack was sitting on the floor by his bed. Peeking out from the unzipped top, the scorched edges clearly visible, was Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13. Izuku froze. Slowly, as if in a trance, he lowered his hands. He looked at the backpack. Then, he turned his head to look at the massive bookshelf that dominated the wall opposite his bed. Lined up in perfect, chronological order, were 12 other identical notebooks. Some were dog-eared, some were water-damaged, all of them were filled cover to cover with his cramped, frantic handwriting. Izuku pushed himself off the floor. He walked over to the bookshelf, his hands trembling for an entirely different reason now. He pulled out Volume 1. The cover was faded. He had written it when he was 7 years old. He opened it. The drawings were childish, crayon sketches of all might and endeavor. But even then, there were crude attempts at understanding. Endeavor's fire comes from his skin. How hot? Melts asphalt. Asphalt melts at 50 degrees Celsius. He put it back and pulled out Volume 7. Age 12. The handwriting was sharper, denser. He flipped to a page dedicated to the pro-hero, Snipe. Snipe's homing quirk is powerful, but heavily reliant on his modified Magnum revolvers, the text read. The guns are custom-made to handle high-pressure rounds. Barrel length, 6 inches. Material, high-carbon steel alloy with a titanium nitride coating for heat resistance. The internal rifling is cut at a 110 twist rate to stabilize the specialized projectiles. Schematic below. Beneath the text was an impossibly detailed, hand-drawn cross-section of Snipe's revolver. Izuku had spent 3 weeks researching ballistics, metallurgy, and firearm mechanics to draw that diagram perfectly. He had memorized the exact dimensions, the weight distribution, and the internal spring mechanisms of the gun. Izuku's breath hitched. He dropped Volume 7 and pulled out Volume 9. This volume was dedicated entirely to support gear. He flipped rapidly through the pages. Page 34, Empty Lady's Costume. Spandex woven with unstable molecules to allow for rapid expansion without tearing. Tensile strength requirements. Page 56, Eraserhead's capture weapon. A proprietary blend of carbon nanofibers woven with a special memory metal alloy. The cloth responds to kinetic energy and microvibrations in the user's muscles. Weave pattern diagram. Page 82. Kamui wood's lacquered chain prison. Though generated organically, the structure of the wood is identical to high-density mahogany, reinforced with a lacquer resin that increases impact resistance by 400%. Cellular structure of the wood drawn below. Izuku stumbled back, falling onto his bed, a hysterical, breathless laugh escaping his lips. He wasn't ignorant. He hadn't spent the last 10 years wasting his life chasing an impossible fantasy. Every time his mother looked at him with pity as he muttered over a notebook, every time Katsuki blew up his desk for being a creepy nerd, Every single hour he had spent locked in his room reading college-level engineering forums and metallurgy textbooks. It hadn't been a waste. He had been building a database. He possessed encyclopedic, eidetic knowledge of the most advanced hero support gear on the planet. He knew the measurements. He knew the materials. He knew the structural weak points and the chemical compositions. The blueprints were already in his head. I don't need to invent anything, Izuku laughed, tears welling up in his eyes, tracking clean lines through the soot on his face. I just need to print them. The clock on his wall ticked. 11 a.m., 21 hours. Izuku leaped off the bed. The despair was gone, replaced by a frantic, manic energy. The analytical machine in his head shifted into overdrive. He needed to test the theory. He needed to create something complex, something mechanical, using the blueprints stored in his notebooks. He flipped through volume 9 again, his eyes scanning the pages until he stopped on a specific entry. Item: restraining rings, early prototype used by Kamui Woods before full mastery of his quirk. Description: a pair of heavy-duty, spring-loaded locking rings designed to snap around a target's wrists or ankles. Materials: main body composed of compressed, high-density wood fiber. Hinge and locking mechanism composed of carbon steel. Spring composed of tempered music wire. Mechanics: impact triggered. When the interior of the open ring strikes a solid object, a wrist, the pressure releases the kinetic spring, snapping the two steel-reinforced halves shut with 500 pounds of clamping force. Locking teeth engage automatically. It was perfect. It was non-lethal, highly effective for incapacitating villains, or robots, and the materials required were basic. Carbon, iron, and wood. Izuku looked around his room, hunting for raw mass. He grabbed his heavy metal desk lamp and ripped the cord out of the wall. He threw it onto the center of the floor. He turned to his bookshelf, removing a thick, solid oak dictionary that he rarely used. He tossed it next to the lamp. He added a few plastic All Might action figures, a painful sacrifice, but necessary, to provide extra carbon and synthetic polymers. He knelt on the floor in front of the pile of junk. Okay, Izuku whispered. He closed his eyes. He didn't just picture the ring. He constructed it in his mind. He visualized the oak wood of the dictionary being stripped down to its cellular level, the cellulose fibers intertwining, compressing, becoming harder and denser than natural wood. He visualized the steel of the desk lamp melting down, the impurities being burned away, the iron atoms aligning into a perfect, flawless lattice for the hinges and locking teeth. He pictured the coiled tension of the tempered spring, calculating the exact amount of kinetic energy it needed to snap shut. He saw the blueprint glowing in his mind's eye, a perfect 3D rendering floating in a void. He pressed his hands against the pile on the floor. Forge. The eruption of light was instantaneous and violent. The emerald flare blinded him, casting stark, razor-sharp shadows against the walls of his room. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched, metallic screech of matter being violently ripped apart and forced back together. The air in the room grew instantly hot. The smell of burning oak, ozone, and molten iron filled his nostrils. Izuku pushed through the sensory overload. The mental strain was immense. It felt like he was trying to solve 50 complex calculus equations simultaneously while balancing on a tightrope. He could feel the matter trying to rebel, trying to collapse into slag, but he held the blueprint firm in his mind, forcing his will upon the atoms. Lock the hinge. Compress the spring. Bind the wood fibers. The green light flared one final, blinding time, and then snapped out of existence. Izuku gasped, falling backward onto the floor, his chest heaving. His head pounded with a vicious migraine, and his hands felt like they had been dipped in boiling water. He blinked away the afterimages of the green light. Sitting perfectly in the center of the floor, where the lamp and the dictionary had been, was a ring. It was beautiful. It was about the size of a large handcuff, painted in a deep, glossy faux lacquer finish. The body was thick and solid, bearing the faint, compressed grain of oak wood. The hinges were flawless, shining silver steel. The interior of the open ring revealed a pressure pad and vicious-looking locking teeth. Izuku crawled forward, his hands shaking as he reached out. The ring was heavy, easily weighing 2 pounds, and warm to the touch. It felt exactly like a piece of high-grade, professionally manufactured hero support gear. I did it, he breathed, a smile breaking across his exhausted face. I actually did it. He needed to test it. He picked up the ring by the back hinge. He looked around the room and spotted the thick wooden leg of his bed frame. It was roughly the diameter of a human wrist. Izuku pulled his arm back and threw the ring at the bedpost. The open ring struck the wood. The interior pressure pad depressed instantly upon contact. Clack snik. The sound was sharp, heavy, and incredibly satisfying. The tempered spring deployed with ferocious speed, snapping the two halves of the ring shut around the bedpost. The carbon steel teeth bit deep into the wood of the bed frame, locking into place with an immovable, ironclad grip. Izuku rushed over and grabbed the ring, trying to pry it open. It didn't budge a millimeter. The locking mechanism was flawless. Without a specialized key, or strength exceeding 500 pounds of force, whoever was caught in that ring wasn't going anywhere. It's perfect, Izuku laughed, resting his forehead against the bedpost. It's absolutely perfect. If I can make a dozen of these, I can trap the robot's treads. I can lock their joints. I can. His celebration was cut violently short. It hit him without warning. A wave of nausea so profound and absolute that the world tilted violently on its axis. Izuku's eyes rolled back in his head. He let go of the ring and collapsed sideways onto the floor, curling into a tight fetal position. Af! He choked out, clutching his stomach as a spasm of agonizing pain ripped through his abdomen. It felt like a jagged knife was being twisted in his gut. But it wasn't just his stomach. The pain radiated outward, down his legs, into his arms, up his spine. His muscles seized, cramping violently. His vision tunneled, the edges of his sight turning a static, fuzzy black. The room began to spin. What is happening? His mind panicked, struggling to form coherent thoughts through the haze of agony. A sudden, intense burning sensation erupted in his nose. He brought a trembling hand up and touched his upper lip. It came away slick and wet with warm, crimson blood. He was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in short, reedy gasps. He felt incredibly, terrifyingly cold. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, and his teeth began to chatter violently. The hunger. It wasn't the sensation of skipping breakfast. It wasn't the grumbling of an empty stomach. It was an animalistic, predatory, cellular starvation. It felt as though his body was eating itself from the inside out. He dragged himself across the floor, his fingernails digging into the carpet. He reached the edge of his bed, using it to pull himself up into a sitting position. He looked down at his arms. His uniform shirt had ridden up slightly. He stared in absolute horror. His forearm, which he had spent the last 10 months meticulously building up with light weights and calisthenics, looked thinner. The muscle definition was softer. The skin looked slightly sunken, clinging tighter to the bone. Izuku's brilliant mind, fighting through the sheer physical agony, finally calculated the cost of his power. The law of equivalent exchange, he thought, his vision swimming. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. I didn't create the ring out of thin air. I used the lamp and the book. But the energy, the sheer thermodynamic energy required to break molecular bonds, melt steel, and rapidly cool it down, where did the heat come from? Where did the energy come from? He touched his sunken stomach. It came from me. The Quirk didn't just run on blueprints. It ran on biological fuel. When he activated the forge, his body rapidly metabolized his own stored energy reserves to produce the heat and kinetic force necessary to manipulate the atomic structures. It burned his blood sugar. It burned his glycogen stores. It burned his fat lipids, and when it ran out of those, it began burning his muscle tissue. To create the steel pipe in the alleyway, he had likely burned through whatever he had eaten for breakfast, plus a significant portion of his body's immediate energy reserves. But to create the complex, multi-material binding ring, a process that required immense mental focus and localized heat, he had essentially forced his body to run a marathon in the span of 5 seconds. He was experiencing acute, catastrophic hypoglycemia, coupled with rapid muscle catabolism. He was literally starving to death. Food, Izuku rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Need calories. He couldn't go to the kitchen. If his mother saw him collapsed on the floor, bleeding from the nose, looking like he had lost 5 pounds in an hour. She would call the hospital immediately. The exam would be gone. His dream would be gone. He had to fix this himself. He dragged himself across the floor to his closet. His limbs felt incredibly heavy, uncoordinated. He pulled open the sliding door and reached into a cardboard box tucked in the back corner. It was his emergency stash. Granola bars, a few bags of potato chips, a jar of peanut butter, and a half-empty box of high-calorie protein bars he had bought in a vain attempt to bulk up. His hands shook so badly he couldn't open the wrapper of the first protein bar. He brought it to his mouth and literally tore into it with his teeth, spitting out the plastic wrapper and biting deeply into the dense, chalky chocolate. He chewed frantically, not even tasting it, forcing it down his dry throat. He grabbed a bag of potato chips, ripped it open, and began shoveling handfuls of the salty, carb-heavy crisps into his mouth. It took 5 minutes of frantic, disgusting eating before the agonizing cramps began to subside. The black edges of his vision slowly receded. The violent shivering stopped. He sat back against the wall of his closet, surrounded by empty wrappers and chip crumbs, breathing heavily. His heart rate slowly returned to a normal rhythm. He wiped the blood from his nose with the back of his hand. He survived. But the reality of his situation crashed down on him with crushing weight. His quirk was incredible. It was versatile, powerful, and limited only by his imagination and his knowledge. But the fuel efficiency was horrific. If creating 1 2-pound binding ring nearly put him into a hypoglycemic coma, how could he possibly fight an army of robots for 10 straight minutes during the UA exam? He couldn't just create a sword and hack at them. He wasn't strong enough. He would need to create complex traps, explosives, specialized gear. He would need to use his quirk dozens of times. He would literally kill himself before the exam was over. Calories, Izuku muttered, staring at the empty jar of peanut butter. I need dense, fast-burning calories. Sugar. Carbohydrates. Lipids. I need to stockpile energy in my body, and I need a way to replenish it mid-battle. He looked at the clock on his desk. 12:30 p.m. 19.5 hours. He couldn't train in his room anymore. He had run out of junk mass to use as raw materials, and he couldn't risk collapsing where his mother could find him. He needed an endless supply of materials to practice on. He needed space to move, to learn how to fight with the gear he created. And he needed thousands of calories. An image flashed into his mind. Dagoba Municipal Beach. It was a dumping ground on the edge of the city, completely filled with illegal trash, rusted appliances, scrapped cars, and endless amounts of raw, inorganic matter. It was isolated, ignored by the public, and massive. It was the perfect forge. Izuku slowly stood up. His legs were still wobbly, but the food was kicking in, sending fresh glucose to his starving brain. He walked over to his desk and picked up Volume 9. He flipped past the binding rings, past Empty Lady's suit, to a section titled, Standard Loadout Theory, the Versatile Hero. If he was going to survive the exam, he couldn't rely on making complex, massive items on the fly. It cost too much energy. He needed a loadout. 3 or 4 highly efficient, low-mass, high-impact items that he could create instantly, without thinking, and without draining his biological battery to zero. A weapon, he muttered, writing down a list on a fresh notepad. A mobility tool. An explosive or distraction. And a capture tool. He looked at his blistered hands. They throbbed with a dull ache, a constant reminder of the fire that now lived inside him. He walked to his closet and pulled out a fresh, dark green tracksuit. He grabbed a large duffel bag. He sneaked out of his room, tiptoeing past the living room where his mother was still watching the news, and slipped into the kitchen. He opened the pantry and systematically began emptying it into his duffel bag. Bags of sugar, boxes of pasta, jars of honey, every single high-calorie item he could find. He didn't care if he got in trouble later. This was survival. He zipped up the heavy bag, slung it over his shoulder, and slipped out the front door, locking it silently behind him. The sun was high in the sky now, beating down on the streets of Muzurifu. The city was moving on from the villain attack, returning to its normal, quirk-filled rhythm. Izuku Midoriya walked down the street, his burnt notebook in one hand, a bag of raw calories slung over his shoulder, heading toward the rusted mountains of Dagoba Beach. He wasn't just a fan anymore. He was a factory. And the assembly line was about to open. Time remaining 18 hours. The trek to Dagoba Municipal Beach felt like a death march. The mid-afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the streets of Muzidafu, baking the asphalt and creating shimmering heat mirages over the hoods of idling cars. Izuku Midoriya walked with his head down, a faded green baseball cap pulled low over his eyes to hide his soot-stained face and the manic, exhausted gleam in his emerald eyes. Over his right shoulder, he carried his burnt yellow backpack, now stuffed to the brim with his 13 volumes of hero analysis for the future. Over his left shoulder hung a massive, dark blue duffel bag that dug painfully into his collarbone. It weighed nearly 40 pounds. It was packed with every dense source of carbohydrates, lipids, and raw sugar he had been able to smuggle out of his apartment. 3 boxes of dry spaghetti, 2 bags of raw cane sugar, a giant tub of cheap peanut butter, a bottle of vegetable oil, 4 loaves of white bread, and an assortment of high-calorie protein bars he had bought months ago. It was a veritable feast of absolute garbage. To a normal person, it was a fast track to diabetes and heart disease. To Izuku, it was ammunition. The heat inside his body was a constant, low-level thrum. Ever since he had forged the binding ring in his bedroom, his metabolism had not turned off. He felt like a furnace that had been left on the pilot light setting. He was sweating profusely, but his skin felt cool and clammy to the touch. His stomach gave a low, echoing rumble, reminding him that the protein bars he had shoved down his throat an hour ago were already gone, incinerated by the demanding, parasitic nature of his newly awakened quirk. 1400 hours, the digital clock on a bank sign flashed as he walked past. 2 p.m. 18 hours until the UA entrance exam gates opened. He didn't have time to be tired. He didn't have time to be scared. He only had time to work. The sounds of the city began to fade as he reached the industrial outskirts. The pristine glass storefronts and bustling pedestrian crosswalks gave way to cracked sidewalks, abandoned warehouses, and chain-link fences topped with rust-bitten razor wire. The smell of the ocean hit him, a thick, briny scent, laced heavily with the acrid tang of oxidized metal, rotting seaweed, and decaying plastics. Izuku crested the final hill, stepping off the pavement and onto a patch of scrubby, yellow dune grass. He stopped, adjusting the agonizing weight of the duffel bag, and looked out over his new kingdom. Dagoba Municipal Beach was a monument to societal apathy. For years, illegal dumping had gone unchecked, transforming what was once a beautiful coastline into a towering, jagged mountain range of refuse. Pyramids of rusted washing machines sat next to the skeletal chassis of stripped automobiles. Mountains of blown-out tires, shattered cathode ray tube televisions, twisted I-beams, and unidentifiable husks of industrial machinery stretched for miles down the shore. The trash piles were so high they completely obscured the ocean, casting long, jagged shadows across the sand. It was an environmental disaster. It was a local tragedy. Izuku dropped his bags onto the sand, a feral, ecstatic grin stretching across his face. It was the greatest forge on planet Earth. Millions of tons of raw, unrefined mass. Iron, steel, aluminum, copper, zinc, synthetic polymers, tempered glass, carbon, silicon. Everything he could possibly need to build an arsenal was sitting right here, waiting to be broken down and reborn. There were no people to see his green light. There was no property damage to worry about. He could go wild. He scrambled down the dune, dragging his heavy bags behind him. He found a relatively clear patch of sand, shielded from the road by a towering, 3-story high pile of rusted refrigerators and mangled bicycles. The surf crashed gently against the shore 100 yards away, the sound muffled by the labyrinth of garbage. Izuku unzipped the duffel bag. He pulled out a loaf of white bread, a butter knife, and the massive tub of peanut butter. He didn't sit down. He stood in the sand, aggressively slathering inches-thick layers of peanut butter onto the bread, folding it over, and shoving it into his mouth. It was dry, cloying, and hard to swallow, but he forced it down with a swig of warm water from a plastic bottle. He needed a baseline of slow-burning lipids and complex carbohydrates in his system before he even attempted to activate the quirk again. As he chewed, his eyes darted around the immediate vicinity, his mind categorizing the trash. Iron oxide in the fridges. Aluminum in the soda can scattered on the ground. Vulcanized rubber in those tires. Copper wiring buried in that busted transformer box. He swallowed the heavy lump of food and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He pulled out a fresh, unburned notebook from his backpack, a blank volume he had purchased last week. He uncapped a pen and wrote across the top in bold letters, "The loadout." "I cannot fight hand-to-hand," Izuku muttered to himself, his voice sounding small against the backdrop of the crashing waves. The Yuri exam uses robots. Standard 0-point to 3-point scale. They are made of armor plating. Punching them is out of the question. I need a weapon that maximizes kinetic impact while keeping me out of their immediate reach. He drew a straight line down the center of the page. Item 1. The staff. He had made a steel pipe in the alleyway. It had worked, but it was incredibly inefficient. Solid carbon steel was far too heavy. It had unbalanced him, required 2 hands to swing properly, and the sheer density of it had cost him a massive amount of calories to compress. He needed something lighter, faster, and more durable. Alloy, Izuku muttered, his pen flying across the page. I need an aluminum-titanium alloy, reinforced with a carbon nanotube core for flexibility. If it's too rigid, the vibrational shock of hitting a robot will shatter my wrists. It needs to bend, absorb kinetic energy, and snap back. Like Kamui Wood's branches, but metallic. He set the notebook down on the sand. He walked over to a pile of refuse and began digging. He needed the base materials. He found a graveyard of old, aluminum baseball bats and mountain bike frames. He dragged them into the center of his clearing. Then, he spent 20 minutes hunting for carbon, finally settling on a massive, heavy bag of charcoal briquettes someone had dumped after a beach barbecue. For the titanium, he got lucky. He found a set of discarded, high-end golf clubs, their shafts made of a titanium alloy. He piled it all together. A small mound of aluminum, titanium, and carbon. Izuku stood before the pile, rolling his shoulders, shaking out the tension in his hands. The blisters from the morning were still raw, but he ignored the sting. Visualize, he ordered himself, closing his eyes. He brought up the blueprints of Pro Hero Bojutsu's legendary staff. He stripped away the superficial design and focused purely on the atomic architecture. He visualized the aluminum and titanium atoms bonding, creating a lightweight outer shell. He visualized the carbon from the charcoal stretching, thinning out into microscopic, hexagonal lattices, nanotubes, weaving together to form a flexible, indestructible core running through the center of the weapon. Length, 1.8 meters. Diameter, 3 centimeters. He opened his eyes, dropped to one knee, and slammed his palms onto the pile of trash. Ignite. The green light exploded outward. It wasn't a flash this time. It was a sustained, roaring pillar of emerald energy that illuminated the towering walls of garbage around him. The sound of tearing metal shrieked through the air. Izuku's teeth ground together. The caloric drain was instantaneous and brutal. It felt as though a vacuum hose had been attached to his stomach, aggressively sucking the peanut butter and bread he had just eaten straight into his bloodstream and incinerating it. His mind dove into the macroscopic sludge. He separated the alloys from the impurities. He forced the carbon to weave. The heat radiating from his hands was unbearable, stinging the hairs on his arms. Weave! He screamed through gritted teeth, his veins bulging bright green against his pale skin. Bind the lattice. Compress the shell. The pile of trash violently collapsed inward. The light flashed blindingly bright, and then abruptly died, plunging the clearing back into the muted grays of the late afternoon. Izuku fell backward onto the sand, gasping for air. His arms were shaking so violently he could barely prop himself up. His stomach let out a hollow, agonizing growl. The peanut butter was gone. The energy was spent. He looked at the center of the clearing. Lying on the sand was a staff. It was completely matte black, absorbing the sunlight rather than reflecting it. It was completely smooth, with no seams or welding marks. Izuku crawled forward and wrapped his blistered hand around the center. He lifted it. His eyes widened in shock. It weighed almost nothing. It felt like holding a hollow bamboo reed, yet as he tapped it against a rusted washing machine, it produced a dense, resonant ping that spoke of terrifying structural integrity. He stood up, backing away from the trash piles to give himself space. He gripped the staff with both hands and gave it a tentative swing. It cut through the air with a sharp, terrifying whoosh. He swung it harder, bringing it down on the rusted, dented hood of a scrapped sedan. Krakom! The impact was explosive. The staff didn't just dent the hood, it sheared straight through the rusted iron, leaving a massive, jagged crater. The kinetic feedback traveling up the shaft was completely absorbed by the carbon nanotube core. Izuku felt only a mild vibration in his wrists. The staff hadn't bent. It hadn't chipped. It's perfect, Izuku breathed, staring at the weapon in awe. It's an absolute masterpiece. But the victory was short-lived. A wave of dizziness hit him, dropping him to his knees. The hunger pains returned, sharp and biting. He crawled back to his duffel bag. This time, he didn't bother with bread. He grabbed a box of dry spaghetti, ripped the top off, and began crunching on the raw noodles, desperately needing the complex carbohydrates. He chased it with a handful of raw sugar. It was disgusting. It made him want to vomit, but he forced himself to swallow, holding his hands over his mouth to keep his body from rejecting the fuel. One item down, he rasped, looking at the setting sun. The sky was turning a bruised purple, casting long, eerie shadows across the beach. 17:30. 5:30 p.m. 15 hours left. Item 2, Izuku muttered, pulling his notebook over. The flashbang. If he couldn't destroy a robot, he needed to blind its sensors, disorient it, or create a smokescreen for escape or a tactical reposition. He needed an explosive. This was the terrifying part. Forging a solid object was one thing. Forging volatile chemicals meant playing with fire on an atomic scale. If he miscalculated the exothermic reaction during the forge, the materials would detonate in his hands, blowing his arms off at the elbows. I need magnesium, he said, tapping his pen against his chin. Lots of it. And aluminum powder. Potassium nitrate as an oxidizer. He spent the next hour scavenging as the twilight deepened into true night. He dragged an old Volkswagen engine block, rich in magnesium alloys, to his clearing. He found dozens of crushed aluminum cans. The oxidizer was trickier, but he had prepared for this. He pulled a bag of commercial stump remover, pure potassium nitrate, from his backpack, purchased from a hardware store on his walk over. By the time he had the materials assembled, the moon had risen, casting a pale, ghostly light over Dagoba Beach. The wind had picked up, carrying the chill of the ocean. Izuku sat cross-legged in the sand, the heavy engine block, the cans, and the white powder piled before him. He closed his eyes and brought up the chemical blueprints. He had studied the exact composition of Katsuki's explosive sweat for years, trying to understand the exact ratios of nitroglycerin and ammonium nitrate. He had studied the support gear of pro-heroes who used flashbangs. Casing, aluminum. Thin, designed to rupture at extreme pressure. Core, a precise mixture of magnesium powder and potassium nitrate. Ignition, a friction-based striker mechanism. The chemistry was delicate. The forging process would naturally generate heat. If the heat exceeded the auto-ignition temperature of the magnesium mixture while he was building it, he would die. He had to forge cold. He had to suppress the kinetic energy of his quirk, pulling the heat into himself rather than pushing it outward. Okay, Izuku whispered, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Slow. Precise. No mistakes. He placed his hands on the pile. Forge. The green light that leaked from his fingers this time was dim, pulsating like a dying firefly. He felt the immense weight of the engine block. He began to carefully, agonizingly strip the magnesium atoms away from the alloy. It was like trying to pull individual threads out of a tightly woven tapestry while wearing thick winter gloves. The mental strain was astronomical. He had to hold the aluminum casing in his mind, while simultaneously grinding the magnesium into a microscopic powder, while simultaneously mixing in the oxidizer, all while artificially suppressing the heat of the atomic friction. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. His nose began to bleed, a warm trail of crimson sliding over his lips and dripping onto his lap. The caloric drain was different this time. It wasn't a violent suction, but a slow, agonizing bleed. It felt like his brain was literally running out of glucose, misfiring, stuttering. Hold it, he commanded himself, his vision blurring. Keep the heat down. Bind the casing. Seal it. The green light flared, stuttered, and vanished. Izuku gasped, falling backward, clutching his pounding head. He felt nauseous. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. He forced his eyes open and looked at the sand. Resting in the dim moonlight were 3 smooth, cylindrical silver canisters. They looked identical to military-grade flashbang grenades, complete with a friction pin ring at the top. He didn't celebrate this time. The dread was too heavy. He picked one up. It was cold. It felt perfect. But was the chemical mixture stable? Was it a dud? Or was it a bomb? He stood up, his legs shaking violently. He walked 20 paces away from his duffel bag, toward a towering pile of rusted washing machines. He pulled the pin. The friction striker sparked. Izuku threw the canister as hard as he could into the center of the trash pile and violently threw himself face first into the sand, covering his ears and burying his face in his arms. 1. 2. THRE. FWOSH bang. The explosion was catastrophic. It wasn't a military-grade flashbang. Izuku had miscalculated the compression ratio of the magnesium powder. He had made it too dense. The detonation didn't just create light and sound, it created a concussive shockwave of expanding plasma. The entire pile of washing machines was violently blown apart. Shrapnel shrieked through the air, tearing into the surrounding garbage dunes. A blinding, sun-white light flashed so bright that even with his eyes squeezed shut and buried in his arms, Izuku saw a stark, terrifying negative image of his own bones through his eyelids. The shockwave rolled over him, burying him in a layer of displaced sand and deafening him completely. Izuku lay there for a long time, his ears ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine. His heart was beating so fast he thought it might literally burst through his ribs. Slowly, he pushed himself up. He coughed, spitting out a mouthful of sand. He turned to look at the crater. The washing machines were gone, replaced by a smoking, blackened depression in the sand. The edges of the rusted metal that remained were glowing a dull, cherry red from the heat of the magnesium fire. Too strong, Izuku croaked, unable to hear his own voice over the ringing in his ears. If I use that indoors, I'll kill everyone in the testing zone. He looked at the remaining 2 canisters sitting by his bag. They were lethal. They were overpowered. They were perfect. He just needed to be extremely careful with where he threw them. He stumbled back to his base camp. His body was failing. The hunger was no longer a sharp pain. It was a deep, hollow ache in his bones. His muscles felt soft, useless. Autophagy had begun again. His body was consuming its own muscle tissue to keep his brain functioning. He fell to his knees in front of his duffel bag. He grabbed a box of sugar cubes. He didn't even bother chewing. He just swallowed them whole, chasing them with thick, nauseating gulps of vegetable oil. He gagged, his body violently trying to reject the pure fat and sugar, but he forced it down, clamping a hand over his mouth and breathing heavily through his bloody nose until the urge to vomit passed. Midnight. The digital watch on his wrist beeped. 8 hours remaining. Item 3, Izuku whispered, his voice trembling. The capture tape. He dragged himself back to his notebook. He needed a way to bind the robot's treads, gum up their gears, or capture them entirely. He needed Eraserhead's binding cloth, but he couldn't weave fabric. He needed something simpler. Sirohanta, Izuku muttered, recalling the tape-dispensing boy he had seen on a hero forum. But stronger. Industrial strength. He needed carbon nanotubes for tensile strength, suspended in a highly viscous, rapidly expanding polyurethane adhesive. A sticky, unbreakable web. This was the hardest one yet. It required complex chemical synthesis and structural weaving simultaneously. He scavenged for an hour, dragging plastic lawn chairs, rubber tires, and more charcoal to his pile. His vision was swimming. The world kept tilting to the left. He was severely dehydrated, running entirely on junk food and sheer, psychotic willpower. He sat before the pile. He brought up the chemical blueprints for high-tack adhesives and carbon weaves. Forge. The green light erupted. It was erratic, flashing violently, mirroring Izuku's failing concentration. The pain was immediate and absolute. It felt as though his very soul was being ripped through his pores. He screamed, a raw, ragged sound that was swallowed by the crashing waves. Bind! Weave! Synthesize! He pushed his mind past the pain, past the nausea, past the screaming protests of his starving cells. He forced the plastic to liquefy. He forced the carbon to weave into microscopic threads. He forced the rubber to break down into a sticky, elastic resin. He felt his body giving out. The edges of his vision didn't just go black. They completely shattered into static. His arms buckled, his face falling inches away from the swirling, superheated mass of reforming matter. With one final, desperate scream of exertion, he severed the connection. The light died. Izuku collapsed flat onto the sand, his cheek resting against the cold, damp earth. He couldn't move. He couldn't even twitch his fingers. Lying in the center of the pile of ash and slag were two heavy, cylindrical cartridges. They looked like oversized spools of duct tape, but the material wound around them was a shimmering, pitch-black ribbon of carbon-reinforced adhesive. He had done it. He had the loadout. The staff. The flashbangs. The tape. Test it, a voice in his head whispered. It sounded like Katsuki. You're not a hero just because you have toys, Deku. You don't know how to fight. Izuku groaned, forcing his hands into the sand. He pushed himself up. Every muscle in his body screamed in agony. His joints felt like they were filled with crushed glass. He grabbed the staff in his right hand. He grabbed a tape cartridge in his left. He tucked a flashbang into the waistband of his tracksuit. Simulation, Izuku panted, staggering toward a cluster of rusted vehicles and appliances. 3 targets. Close quarters. He imagined the rusted refrigerator was a 1-pointer. The scrap sedan was a 2-pointer. The towering pile of tires was a 3-pointer. He took a deep, shuddering breath. Go. He lunged forward. His legs felt like lead, his speed pathetic, but he forced himself through the motions. He swung the staff at the refrigerator, the carbon nanotube core absorbing the massive impact as the metal caved in. He spun around, pulling the flashbang from his waistband. He ripped the pin with his teeth, a terrible idea that nearly cracked his incisor, and hurled it behind the sedan. He didn't wait for the explosion. He threw himself behind a pile of trash, covering his ears. Boom! The shockwave rattled his teeth. The light strobed across the beach. Before the light even faded, Izuku was up and running toward the tire pile. He gripped the heavy spool of capture tape. He didn't have a dispenser, so he had to do it manually. He grabbed the end of the shimmering black ribbon, wrapped it around a protruding pipe on the tires, and sprinted in a circle, unraveling the tape. He pulled the tape taut. It didn't snap. It didn't even stretch. It was immovably strong, locking the heavy tires into a solid, unyielding mass. He had done it. He had executed a flawless tactical takedown of 3 theoretical targets. He stood in the center of the trash piles, leaning heavily on his staff, his chest heaving with ragged, wet gasps. He had a quirk. He had weapons. He had a strategy. I can pass, Izuku thought, a single, hot tear cutting through the grime on his cheek. I can actually do this. I'm going to UA. And then, the bill came due. The adrenaline that had been propping up his failing biology abruptly evaporated. Izuku felt a sudden, terrifying cold wash over his brain. It wasn't just dizziness. It was a total systemic shutdown. His heart skipped a beat, fluttered wildly, and then slowed to a sluggish, agonizing crawl. His grip on the staff failed. It clattered to the sand. No, Izuku whispered, his voice slurring. Not yet. Need to eat. He turned toward his base camp. It was only 50 feet away. It looked like a mile. He took one step. His knee buckled. He crashed face first into the sand, the impact jarring his teeth. He tried to push himself up, but his arms completely refused to respond. They lay limp at his sides. Hypoglycemic shock, his analytical mind supplied, clinically detached from the terror of his dying body. Blood sugar levels critical. Brain function terminating. He couldn't breathe. His lungs fluttered weakly, unable to draw in the heavy, salty air. The world was fading. The sounds of the ocean became distant, muffled, like he was sinking underwater. He had pushed too hard. He had used a quirk that required massive biological fuel, and he had completely drained the tank. He had literally starved himself to death on a beach of garbage in the middle of the night. Mom, he thought, a profound, crushing sadness settling over him as the darkness closed in. I'm sorry. I almost made it. His eyes rolled back, and Izuku Midoriya slipped into the absolute, silent black. Cold. That was the first sensation. A biting, damp cold seeping into his bones from the ground. Then came the smell. Ozone, rust, and blood. His own blood. I'm dead, Izuku thought sluggishly. I died on the beach. Hiss. A sharp, metallic sound pierced the darkness. Suddenly, a massive, rough hand slid under the back of his neck, lifting his head from the wet sand. Open your mouth, young man, a voice commanded. It was deep, rough, and laced with an undercurrent of genuine panic. Izuku couldn't obey. His jaw was locked shut. Fingers pinched his cheeks, gently but firmly forcing his mouth open. Cold metal pressed against his bottom lip. A liquid poured over his tongue. It was sickeningly sweet, thick, and tasted of artificial citrus, caffeine, and raw corn syrup. It was an energy drink. Swallow, the voice urged. Come on, kid. Swallow. Izuku's throat worked instinctively, gagging slightly before swallowing the heavy liquid. The sugar hit his stomach like a lit match hitting a pool of gasoline. The effect wasn't instantaneous, but it was aggressive. Within seconds, his heart gave a massive, painful thud, kickstarting his circulation. The sugar rushed into his bloodstream, carrying desperate, life-saving fuel to his starving brain. Izuku gasped, his eyes flying open. The world was a blurry, spinning mess of gray and black. He coughed violently, choking on the remaining liquid in his mouth. Easy. Easy now. Small sips. The hand behind his head supported him as he was tilted up slightly. The can was brought back to his lips. Izuku drank greedily this time, his hands weakly coming up to grasp the stranger's wrist. The wrist was incredibly thin, almost skeletal. He drained the can. The stranger tossed it aside into the sand and opened a second one, pressing it into Izuku's hands. Drink that one slowly, the voice instructed. Izuku sat up, his vision finally stabilizing, the gray static receding. He was still on Dagoba Beach. The moon was still high. The ocean was still crashing. He looked at his savior. Kneeling in the sand beside him was a man. He was shockingly gaunt, his limbs looking like sticks wrapped in oversized clothes. He wore a baggy white t-shirt and loose cargo pants. His face was deeply shadowed, his cheekbones sharp and skeletal, and his eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, glowing with a faint, piercing blue light. Long, stringy blonde hair fell around his face, two distinct bangs hanging down like deflated rabbit ears. A trail of blood leaked from the corner of the man's mouth, which he casually wiped away with the back of his hand. Izuku stared. His oxygen-starved brain struggled to process the image. He knew those blue eyes. He knew those two bangs. He had seen them in an alleyway just hours ago. He had seen them on a rooftop just hours before that. All Might? Izuku rasped, his voice sounding like cracked glass. Toshinori Yagi let out a heavy, tired sigh, sitting back on his haunches in the sand. He looked at the half-eaten loaf of peanut butter bread, the empty sugar bags, and the glowing crater of melted washing machines in the distance. Finally, his eyes settled on the sleek, matte black carbon alloy staff lying in the dirt near Izuku's feet. I came to check on you, Midoriya, Toshinori said, his deep voice quiet against the sound of the ocean. I felt guilty about what I said on the roof. I went to your apartment, but your mother said you were asleep. I knew she was lying. Or at least mistaken. I saw the look in your eyes in that alley. Toshinori picked up the heavy metal staff. He weighed it in his hands, his skeletal fingers tracing the flawless, seam-free surface of the weapon. He looked back at Izuku, his sunken blue eyes widening with profound, unbelievable shock. I thought I understood what happened today, Toshinori whispered, dropping the staff back onto the sand. I thought you had a latent telekinetic quirk. But you didn't just move this metal, did you? Izuku clutched the energy drink, his hands shaking, his body still trembling from the brush with death. He shook his head slowly. I made it, Izuku whispered. I can forge things. But it burns my calories. It eats my energy. I pushed too hard. Toshinori stared at the boy. He looked at the scattered textbooks. He looked at the massive duffel bag of junk food. He looked at the craters and the destruction this single, quirkless boy had wrought upon the beach in a matter of hours. The symbol of peace closed his eyes and let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. You magnificent, reckless idiot, Toshinori said softly. He opened his eyes, leaning forward, the intensity in his gaze pinning Izuku to the sand. You have a weapon. You have a power, but you are going to kill yourself before you ever step foot in that exam. Toshinori stood up, his gaunt frame casting a long shadow over Izuku in the moonlight. He reached a skeletal hand down. Having a weapon doesn't mean you know how to wield it, Midoriya, Toshinori said, his voice dropping the tired facade, ringing with the absolute, uncompromising authority of the number one hero. Get up. Izuku stared at the offered hand. The pain in his body was immense. The exhaustion was soul-crushing. But the fire inside him, the forge, was burning brighter than ever. He dropped the energy drink. He reached up, grasped All Might's hand, and pulled himself to his feet. You have 6 hours, Toshinori said, stepping back and dropping into a flawless, balanced combat stance. I cannot give you my power. But I can teach you how to survive.